Participles, the adjective form of the verb, are very important in Latin. Very important. So in English, we love our subordinate clauses, but Latin loves its participles. So this makes learning about participles somewhat rough for an English speaker. It's a bit of complex grammar and not something that's easily relatable. I'm going to talk about the future passive participle, also known as the gerundive, how Latin forms it from verbs, and how it is used. So first off, participles are verbal adjectives. And what does this mean? Well, most importantly, it means that participles are adjectives first and foremost. And so because of this, participles always describe nouns. So a participle will have the same case, number, and gender as the noun it describes, but it has the verbal component too, and that's because participles originate from verbs. In this example, puella laudanda est, the girl is to be praised or must be praised. The word laudanda is our participle. It comes from the verb to praise, but really it's acting as an adjective describing the girl. Okay, so to form the future passive participle, we always take the present stem, which is the second principal part of the verb, drop off the re, and to this we add undus aum, with the caveat that third io and fourth conjugation verbs have an ie before the ending. You can also form the future passive participle from the present active participle. Just drop off the ns and add the undus, and there you go. We translate this participle with to be, followed by the past participle. So laudandus is to be praised, monendus to be warned, docendus to be led, faciendus to be done, and audiendus to be heard. But don't confuse this with the present passive infinitive. Though the translation into English may sound the same, the gerundive is an adjective and used in very specific instances in Latin. And finally, the us, a, ending for the gerundive shows that it's first and second declension adjectives. It only takes these endings, even if it's describing a word in the third, fourth, or fifth declension. So you can easily identify the future passive participle, the gerundive, from the nd ending. So we call this participle the gerundive, and from here on out I'm going to interchange the words future passive and gerundive. And the nd in gerundive is the same nd in our Latin form. So that's right, the word gerundive comes from the Latin gerundive of gero, gerundus, to be carried on. Now don't confuse the gerundive with the gerund. The gerundive is the adjective form and the gerund is the noun form. Gerundive, adjective, so you notice that? Yeah. The future passive participle very rarely is used as a standard adjective. So most times in Latin, you'll see it in the passive periphrastic, also known as the gerundive of obligation. A periphrastic, literally, is a way of speaking around something, using more words than you need to, and periphrastics in Latin involve a participle and a form of sum esse. The passive periphrastic has the future passive participle. You could probably guess that the active periphrastic involves the future active participle, but that's a subject for another video. You saw a passive periphrastic at the beginning of this one. Puella laudanda est. The girl is to be praised. And that's a literal translation, but we could much more easily translate this with a must. The girl must be praised. And notice that she is receiving the action. That's because it's a passive periphrastic. And we're showing a sense of necessity or obligation with the must. And that's why we can also call the passive periphrastic the gerundive of obligation. It uses the gerundive and expresses necessity or obligation. Sometimes you will see a passive periphrastic without a subject, as in mihi correndum est. The mihi here is in the dative case, acting as the dative of agent. So it's the word that's doing the action. We translate this as I must run. So ignore the literal translation of this, though. It doesn't really make sense to us in English. And if we say, let's combine the last two sentences here. So puella mihi laudanda est. The girl must be praised by me. Even though mihi is in the dative case, it's still an agent, and we still translate it with by. Or even better, let's do this actively. I must praise the girl. So here's the famous phrase by Cato the Elder. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. And we can add in a dative of agent. Carthago nobis delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed by us, or we must destroy Carthage. We can even play with this a little bit more. So let's change nobis into romanis. And this happened in the history, so est becomes erat, the imperfect. Carthago Romanis delenda erat. Carthage had to be destroyed by the Romans, or the Romans had to destroy Carthage. You know, it's generally accepted that passive periphastics can and should be translated actively whenever possible. It often makes the English sound better. So sometimes you'll see the gerundive in what's called a gerundive phrase, where it describes a noun. I won't go too much in depth with this, but here's a basic example. Consilium urbis capiendi, a plan of taking the city, where capiendi is the gerundive describing urbis. Literally, this is a plan of the city to be taken, but we can massage this into easier English by making the noun the object of the gerundive. Another quick example. Mensa est idonea epistulis scribendis. The table is suitable for writing letters, with the gerundive scribendis modifying epistulis, for letters to be written, for writing letters. There's a much greater discussion to be had on this in gerunds, but I'll save that for later. So those are future passive participles. A quick review. Participles in general are verbal adjectives. They come from verbs, but in truth describe nouns, so they really are adjectives. The future passive participle is also known as the gerundive, and it most often shows an action that has to happen at some time in the future. That's the obligation aspect. And since the participle is passive, that action is going to happen to the noun it describes. We recognize present participles with an nd before the first and second declension endings. And this nd is just like the nd at the end of the word gerundive, which is another term for this participle, and that's not a coincidence. And finally, the future passive participle will often be in a passive periphrastic, so with a form of sum, to be, like puella laudanda est, the girl must be praised, and the agent in a passive periphrastic will be in the dative case, the dative of agent. Puella tibi laudanda est, you must praise the girl.